Welcome, hello, and welcome everybody to a new Rebalance Talk. We are very pleased to have with us Professor Tim Cresswell. He is geographer and poet, and one of the key thinkers involved in the so-called mobility turn, a new paradigm on geography and sociology emerging from mid-90s, mostly by the influence of John Hurry. Hello, Tim.
Hi, really glad to be here.
Great to have you here. As you know, the aim of Rebalance Talk is exploring new mobility cultures and policies and how our mobility culture is changing and how much mobility policies should change. So we are interested on a normative point of view that we are aware you are also interested. So we are deeply interested on mobility meanings as well as on mobility practices, not just on movements or transport as conventionally has been considered in economy and engineering. Our paramount aim is influencing policymakers, which are often embedded into economic and engineering mindsets. So you are perfect for this talk. So thank you very much for being with us. So we have 60 minutes to go, so not rush here. You have to take the time you want to answer my questions or other questions you believe more important. And I will try to remember that at the end of the conversation, last 15 minutes, I have to read the questions that will be proposed by our listeners. I'll transfer these questions to you. So let me begin with a general question, Tim. Do your research interest and methods have changed because of the pandemics? So the year, let's say, we stopped moving, or the pandemics have provided you just new experiences to better illustrate the ideas you already developed in the past?
Well, I mean, it's a very interesting question. I have been teaching all the way through this courses on mobility. And so, my syllabus was constructed in a particular way in, January of last year. And as I was teaching the course, the pandemic struck, and almost everything that I was teaching became, a live experiment. It was happening outside the classroom, outside the window, in the news. Every day, people were talking about, whether people should be walking on the streets more than once a week, or whether they should be going to work or not going to work, or whether they should be going on holiday or not going on holiday, or whether airplanes from specific countries should be stopped from arriving in other countries. And so pretty much everything I was talking about in terms of patterns of movement, that is, things that we can see and observe, the conventional material of transport geographers, transport economists and such like, transport planners. The practices, the ways people move, whether they're driving or flying or walking or running or cycling, and the meanings attached to them, all of them were in constant transformation and negotiation over the last 2 years. So, I constructed my course around these three things: movement, observable physical movement, meaning, and practice. And these were all, just massively and rapidly changing. And we've been talking about that in relation to various things, one that are not the pandemic. So we've been talking about it in relation to environmental catastrophe. That is, the ways that we move, we humans, alongside the various machines and others that help us move, have had an enormous impact on the planet that we live in. So that was already a strong theme in the course. It's like, how should we move in relation to the planet? And the second thing that pre-existed the pandemic, that was part of the course and part of the way I've been thinking, because I tend to teach at the senior level, basically whatever I'm thinking, that's what my classes are like, was justice, was how we move is related to how other people move. It isn't just an individual making a choice, a rational choice, if you like, and about how to get from A to B. Every time that happens, that impacts on other people's choices of getting from A to B, or indeed other people's decisions not to go from A to B. Immobility and mobility are connected to each other. So, you know, particularly Black Lives Matter, you've seen, you know, how people with brown and black skin are stopped from moving in particular ways, or forced to move in particular ways that isn't true generally of white people. And so there's a social justice element there, a social justice element in terms of things like disability, how people move, are allowed to move or are enabled to move in relation to particular disabilities that they have, in relation to gender, which is a long-standing construction of how men and women have been related to mobility in different ways. These are already part of the course, and suddenly the pandemic's there, this new thing. Well, it isn't entirely new actually, but it seems like a new thing. I mean, it's been happening in different parts of the world. Different pandemics have been happening and different diseases have been happening, but not really impacting the West or the rich, the global North in quite the same way. But suddenly this thing is happening across the world, and the most obvious things that are immediately impacting on people's lives are these mobility questions. That is, when shall I take my walk, or should I take my walk, and how many people should I take it with? Should I go to work, or should I try and work at home? And then, of course, can I go to work, or can I work from home? Should I go on holiday? Should I take a plane? All of these things are questions that suddenly we're all thinking about. And some of us, maybe in the richer parts of the world, in the global North, are thinking about for the first time in ways that other people have had to think about it in relation to issues of social justice and environmental change for a long time. So, so there's like a live experiment going on, and all of my thinking and all of my teaching is both using the ideas that I've been developing to think about this new thing, or new thing for some of us, and at the same time thinking how it changes it. I'm not sure if I know how it changes. I think the fundamental categories that I use to think about it haven't changed drastically, but I think empirically the content has changed. And it's allowed us, you know, the catastrophe has allowed us to visualize and envision and see aspects of mobility that we may have found, or many of us, when I say we, I don't mean everyone, but many of us may have been invisible to begin with. You know, for instance, you know, going to work. We had a category of people in Britain, and I think this is true of lots of the developed world, or sorry, the global North, who previously were called low-skilled workers, and usually often migrants, often people of color, often women. And these people were transformed magically into a new category called necessary workers, or I've actually forgotten the actual phrase that's used, or, you know, key workers. So what was low skilled is suddenly necessary and key, like people that deliver things from Amazon, like people that that clean the wards in hospitals, like people, you know, people that can't work from home. You can't do that from home. You can't sit in front of a computer and do it. So you got this transformation based on mobility, linguistically, if you like, about how you imagine the certain whole categories of people, and you start to see the world of work and its relationship to mobility in a particular way, because there's been an interference has happened. And those aren't new categories or new experiences, they just become visible because of the vaccine, because of the virus.
Let me focus a little bit more in the beginning, in the categories of issues that the mobility turn has contributed to make them more visible, probably. You tell me if I'm right or wrong. If I tell you that the mobility turn emphasizes flows, as well as barriers, but mostly flows, time, and not just a space, an abstract place, abstract limited geometry of let's say the reality where we move, but the time is also a matter of interest and networks, instead of a collection of places. And mostly the mobility tour emphasizes meanings, the meaning of traveling, the meaning of moving, instead of just the observed behaviors or practices. Please clarify this cocktail of concepts. I'm sure I'm not being able to explain clearly.
Well, I can certainly see the truth in what you're saying. I mean, there is a change in emphasis. So, I mean, I think that at the heart of mobilities research, at least for me, and I think it's shared by other people that have been involved in it for a long time, is that an aspect of all of our existence on Earth, the fact that we move, had been under theorized, undervalued, just or what the term that's often used, black boxed, or just left as an assumed set of things, so that even people who were studying mobility weren't studying mobility. So, for instance, you take people involved in transport planning, transport geography, transport economics. It fundamentally seems to be about mobility in the way it was formulated in the 1980s or 1970s, for instance. But nothing actually happens. You don't learn anything about the moving part of it. Like, what happens when someone takes a bus? What happens in migration theory between the point A and point B? When someone leaves somewhere and arrives somewhere, you learn about why they left and why they arrived, maybe, but you learn nothing or very little about the journey in between. And that's the movement part. The movement part just gets X'd out of thought. Like, we just don't think about it. So an original part of the mobilities turn on mobilities paradigm was, let's take this bit seriously. Let's fill it with content rather than leave it empty. What is it? What happens in movement? What does movement mean to in human life, and in more than human life, in life between humans and other companion species, and with the immaterial and the material world beyond us? So that was a sort of fundamental point for me, and I think for many others, was just taking it seriously and making it the object of study. But where I disagree with what you're saying is that actually all of the binaries that you construct, I think, are also part of the mobilities turn. So, for instance, you say, we're replacing sort of barriers and boundaries with flows. Well, actually, the mobility world, the mobilities research is about bordering and the way borders happen and boundaries happen and mobility together, rather than saying that borders are disappearing and boundaries are disappearing and everyone can move. Clearly, that would be ludicrous in a way. I mean, many people are facing borders or can't move, and we're just as interested in studying reasons why people are stuck or have to stay put or can choose to stay and not move, as we are with people that move. And we're interested in the relations between them, how boundaries and borders set up new dynamics of mobility and flow. Flows don't just happen in a sort of magical kind of flow world where there's this sort of an ability to move all over the world for everyone. Like I was just saying with COVID, it's more true for some people than others, and we've got to think about the reasons why. Networks haven't completely replaced place. Place is, if there's another thing that I'm fundamentally interested in, it's place and mobility. What I'm interested in is how places are made through mobilities, how places become these stages of mobility, how mobilities don't happen on a blank surface, on an isotropic plane, on the imagined ideal worlds of economists. They happen through places. Mobilities only get purchase on the world in places, and so they're always infected by, well, infected is the wrong word, and an unfortunate one in relation to COVID, but they're always, they have to grasp something, they have to touch down. Mobilities work through places. Even when you're flying in a plane, the plane is a place while you're on it. So these are related terms.
Tim, when you define the kinetic elite, it seems like a social class related to transport, to movement, which is in a way complementing the working class or the classes which are, let's say, related to a place or embedded into a boundary. So in a way, you are overpassing these boundary conditions to define social classes which are related to flows.
Yeah, I mean,
I
think that Zygmunt Bauman and others identified the capital, in Bourdieu's terms, associated with movement and flow, so that in a world that's increasingly mobile, and it is, I mean, no, I think we always have to be historical when thinking about this. It is increasingly mobile in terms of speeds, abundances of mobility of various kinds. I think that mobility then becomes a kind of capital that distinguishes groups in terms of their capacity to move in particular ways, or alternatively to choose not to move, and that relates again to this being able to work from home, right? I'm a member of a kinetic elite as an academic, right? I mean, I've traveled a lot more than many people in the world, but I can also stay at home easier than many other people in the world, and I could do my job with all its stresses and strains. Is still, I find, a privileged job, and I've been able to do it over the last year, basically from the room I'm in now. So there is a kind of way in which there's a stratification of privilege related to mobility, and we can call this a kinetic hierarchy. I'm not sure I would agree that the old versions of the working class and other kinds of hierarchies are necessarily about place, though. I mean, I think the working class or the proletariat in relation to capital, in relation to capitalists, is always about mobility as well. It wasn't the working class was always stuck. There's always been migrant workers, and the reasons that they move are different from the reasons the kinetic elite move, and it's more often about compulsion and less often about choice. So, and I think there was interesting work done that sort of has disappeared, at least in my reading, and I can't keep up with all the reading, as we've been talking about earlier, but when Hart and Negri wrote Empire, their redefinition of the working class was really the multitude, and the multitude was defined by one thing above all things, and that was mobility. Right? The new international multitude is a new version of the working class, or not new anymore because they wrote that book decades ago, but its identity was bound up in its ability to move. Right? They were kind of like the multitude was like the shock troops of a kind of revolution that Hart and Negri were imagining. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but so I think mobility and place are tied up in interesting and conflicting ways in relation to social hierarchy through time.
Yeah. Let me remember one sentence of a very famous Spanish singer called Julio Iglesias, a member of the kinetic elite. He said, "I wish all human beings have a private plane like the one I have." So this is kind of a member of the kinetic elite trying to be in favor of mobility justice in a paradoxical way, because it's impossible everybody to have a private plane.
Oh, maybe he just didn't want other people to be on his planes. I mean,
but it's clear that in this world, if you belong to the kinetic elite, you have a private plane. This is well,
I don't think that's true. I think that the super elite maybe have a private plane, but I mean, I think you can be in a kinetic elite and not be that elite. I mean, I think all of us who regularly fly, and particularly when we fly because we want to go somewhere or we've been invited to somewhere, are members of a kinetic elite, because on a global scale, there's still a minority that has flown ever, and then flying regularly makes you pretty elite. I mean, there's that thing that you have in hierarchies where you always look to people below you and not above you, and sorry, people above you and not below you, and you always claim yourself to be not elite, because there's always someone more elite than you. Well, I think, I'm a member of the kinetic elite. I haven't got a private plane. And certainly it would be a bad idea for everyone to have a private plane, because it would be even worse for the environment than flying is generally. So
property is more place attached than, wealthier people used to be more global and cosmopolitan. This is true.
Yeah, property is, I mean, by definition is stuck. I mean, well, not all property, but real estate is stuck in space. So, so there is that sense of a relationship between property and mobility. But the people that own property, particularly expensive property, are generally also the people that are mobile. So, mobile for out of choice, right? Because people who are propertyless are also mobile. I mean, one of the interesting things that that I'm working on is thinking about the relationship between sort of figures in mobility. So one figure who's mobile is the citizen. Citizens are defined by their mobility. They can move within the countries they're citizens of, and they can move across the borders of that country into other countries with a passport and be afforded certain kinds of protections. Whereas another mobile figure is the vagabond, and the vagabond exists on the margins of this citizenship. They're not real citizens, they're kind of shadow citizens or citizens of a different kind, and they have to be mobile. You know, Zygmunt Bauman defined the tourist and the vagabond. The tourist, that was his way of doing it. I like to think of the citizen and the vagabond because it's more of a political distinction rather than a distinction of leisure and necessity. But you know, these are all mobile people. The vagabond is a mobile person, whether they're a homeless person in the city or if they're a you know, an international refugee. They're propertyless but mobile, but their mobility is completely different from the mobility of the elite.
Mm-hmm. Let me go back to the key categories on the mobility turn in relation to the categories on transport economics, which
Right.
we used to use and we doubt they are useful anymore, but they are right. Death time, for instance, death time or derived demand. This
Yeah.
concepts that in welfare economics are quite fundamental to define cost-benefit analysis, to measure the public interest, and lead us to believe that as many people we have in a bus, transporting them as fast as possible at the cheapest price. This is good for the project. It's a project that should be financed by the public authorities. And it seems that this is kind of oversimplistic in a mature society in which we are. So maybe you can further explain us a little bit better that I have done the concept of death time, the
Right.
concept of derived demand, this
Well, I mean,
like,
dead time was just an expression used to describe the time someone spent commuting, going to work and back, in classical ways of thinking about transport and even town planning and urban planning. And so this was one of the ways that I was saying at the beginning, in ways in which mobility was either black boxed, as in just cut out from serious consideration, or negatively valued. It was, you know, it was a problem. Like mobility is a problem to be solved, and that an ideal spatial formation would reduce the amount of time people spend moving, you know, in sum for the total population. And so mobility is always constructed as this negative, and dead time expresses that perfectly. This is time, kind of pointless time, between somewhere you leave and somewhere you arrive. And and we know that that isn't what happens. When I walk to work, it's this, you know, when I could walk to work, you know, this was a valuable time for me to think, to prepare myself for the day, and to come back from work was a kind of decompression between work and home. The privilege of my job allowed me. Similar things happen in cars and in trains and on bicycles and all the different ways people move when they go between home and work. You know, there are all kinds of positive, pleasurable, productive things that happen as we move, and none of this was accounted for, or still is accounted for, in this notion like dead time or derived demand. The idea that the only reason we move is because of something we want, that is at the end of the movement. That the demand for transport is always derived from something else, like we need to work, we need to go for a leisure pursuit, so we need to go on holiday, or something is defining that. And you know, when I first started encountering that language, it was after I'd already encountered, you know, research on travel and literature, like road movies or novels that are generally on the, you know, on the road, to use Jack Kerouac's famous novel. And in these instances, mobility was, well, you know, what you call autotelic for its own sake. Like the mobility, you know, we have that saying in English about I can't even remember how to say it now, but you know, it's about the journey. It's not about where you're going, it's about the journey. And we know that that has truth in a cultural sense, especially when the journey is in some way chosen and not forced. But these ways of calculating mobility that you're talking about had no space for that very simple idea that there's something in the mobility itself that is of value. It's like out of the equation. And I came across language again and again, particularly in transport geography, where people would write about movement, and they would say, you know, they would write about it in a generic, universalizing way that's technical and usually quantitative, and then say, well, there are a couple of people that, you know, we're not accounting for here, like the person that just likes to go for a Sunday drive, or but they would also follow that by saying, we're not really interested in them. We're not interested. Well, I am interested. And not only that, I don't think it's just a few people. I think it's everyone. I think everyone is invested in mobility in positive and negative ways that are deeply felt, and that we need to pay attention to that and the meanings associated with mobility. Otherwise, we're really not studying it at all.
Mm-hmm. Then this not contradiction, but this oh yeah, maybe a contradiction between, let's take a street. You have people living there, residents,
Mm-hmm.
then there are people moving through the street.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of contradictory interests. Maybe the people moving through the street, they have not always the same interest as the people living on the street. Now, how we can rebalance this on the cities we live? Do you think that the so-called two-speed city as a paradigm may work? So that proximity, in the sense that people move by walking, so it's not in contradiction with people living, but they have mobile phones. They are connected with the rest of the world. They can transmit information in real time. So in a way, you are very slow when walking, but at the same time, you are very fast when you are communicating with others. So this two-speed, let's say, city, do you think we are moving to this direction, or this is an utopia, or this is, what do you think about?
Well, I mean, I don't know if we're fundamentally moving in any direction, and it depends who we are. I mean, the cities all over the world have very different experiences of this, but I certainly think there is a movement afoot that COVID has accentuated and given more of a platform to, which is it comes back to, you know, both COVID, the fact that a pandemic is occurring and there will be more of them, but also the environmental crisis, or the crises, all the different environmental crises that are happening at the same time, and issues of justice and mobility justice are all coalesced around how we plan the spaces we're in, whether it's the city or the country, so whether it's rural or urban. But in the city, we started to see the emergence of people thinking about these things in joined up ways. You know, if you just think about changing the city from the perspective of consumers, or perspective of you know, the well-to-do, wealthy people already, then you won't really address the social justice issues. If you just try and address the environmental issues, then you may produce unjust results, because often environmental planning in cities negatively impacts people who are already negatively impacted, because it's very rarely thinking about the poor and the marginalized. So these things have to be thought about together. And certainly when we look at, you know, I think one of the, I mean, I'm not by no means an expert, but one of the examples that intrigues me is the way Barcelona has been planned in relation to this sort of, what's it called, the 9-block model. So you get 9 blocks of the city, and you sort of redirect the traffic around these blocks, so that within that 9 blocks, most of the thing is by walking, and you can find most of the services you want within it. So it's a bit like the 15-minute model. It's similar.
Yeah.
And what interests me is that it seems that, and again, I haven't done research on it, so there may be some critical scholars out there who can correct me on this, but it seems like the process had a certain degree of processual justice in it, that the citizens were involved in the decision making. I know I'm really reasonably convinced that feminist perspectives were taken on board. And women in particular were asked about how they used the city in Barcelona as part of the way in which Barcelona was being planned. So there are ways in which urban planning can start to think about mobility and its relationship to belonging and living, that can bring in the process of planning them all the voices that need to be brought into it. That's what we call processual justice. Like there's justice in the process as well as the outcome. In fact, you don't get justice in the outcome unless you have justice in the process. So Mimi Scheller talks a lot about this in Mobility Justice. You know, that's one of the ways in which justice happens. And I think that there's signs that is emerging, particularly with COVID. Mutual aid groups all over the world are starting to develop on individual streets to help each other. You know, certain kinds of things are being enabled. Whether they will all disappear when people think the pandemic's over is the question we have to ask, and I don't really know the answer to that.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the slow city movement, slow food, this idea of slowing down growth, even the growth in some respect, that for some people this is close to luxurious ecology as well. So this kind of sophisticated movement. What do you think about?
Yeah, I mean, I think you know,
too fast, and we have to slow down. Let's say we have to implement policies avoiding to go at fast.
Well, I think speed is one thing that is you know, is fascinating. I think Ivan Illich, the great writer on energy and equity, wrote that, you know, the ideal world is a world of 3 miles an hour. That as soon as you move over 3 miles an hour, then inequality increases, basically. And then you're starting to get these sort of inequality with disability. So he said, you know, he basically said, as soon as every mile an hour you go over 3 miles an hour, inequality increases. So you can kind of see a relationship between slowness and equity there. But on the other hand, slowness is a privilege. And in the great Charlie Chaplin movie, Modern Times, it starts with the scene in the factory where Charlie Chaplin is on the conveyor belt, and his body is becoming part of the machine, and there's a guy, the boss in his office, reading a newspaper and eating his breakfast, living a slow life. And all he does every now and then is he turns around and says, speed up. And the factory below speeds up and the workers go faster and faster while he's getting just retaining his life of slowness. So there's a way in which slowness is, even in the way it's expressed in cheetah slow and slow food movements and these and slow towns, is can be thought of as a very bourgeois privilege that doesn't really include the kinds of necessary labor that people have to do in the capitalist economy that can't have the luxury of slowness. So you think instead, you think about the people in a slow city movement who are making their crafts and eating their slow food and having siestas and all of this, all of which, by the way, I think are valuable to think about. I mean, I'm in favor of them personally. I think that kind of life is certainly something to think about. But how can you have that without the necessity of other people having to move fast? How can you have that without deliveries and you know, and people in Amazon factories with their RFID tags being moved around, the people being moved around and tracked to make sure they're doing enough work and enough labor, just like Charlie Chaplin was in Modern Times. I'm not sure that the slow life movement can expand beyond the niches in which it currently exists, because I think the niches can exist because elsewhere people are moving fast, and that speed can be a luxury sometimes and an imposition sometimes. Similarly, slowness can be a luxury or an imposition, depends on the context.
Yeah. I like it very much when at the beginning of the pandemic you're pointing out the number of interesting paradoxes, like the case of Wuhan, that, you know, a city without cars, which means with clean with clean air, meaning that the public health improved a lot in the city because of the air and because no traffic was passing through the streets. And they say that, you said, I think, that the impact in public health of having no traffic was even higher than avoiding the threat of the pandemics. On the other hand, we have a question by Alain Lostis, kind of philosophical question. What happens to places when there is no movement? which is something like, something natural to think about. If you have no blood in your veins and then you have an organ without blood, it seems that traffic and movement is like blood going through your different, or the fluidity is related to life. So if you don't have fluidity, you don't have traffic, you don't have movement, then you are dying.
Well, first of all, places aren't bodies in that literal sense. And when we think about metaphorically, we have to think about what meaning is transferred properly and what meaning is lost in that metaphorical analogy. There is no such thing as a place with no movement. What kind of place is that? Where is that? I mean, I don't know that it's possible. There's no such thing. I mean, there's always movement of some kind, and this is the problem we get ourselves into. If we're a transport planner, we think movement means transport, whereas I have to walk to get to my kitchen. So as long as there's a human in a place, then there's mobility in a place. The question is, what mobility and for what reason and what purpose? Even if there was a place without humans, and then you have to decide whether it's really a place or not, because place itself has a certain conceptual presuppositions. I mean, place is a very human concept. But a place without humans is going to have animals, it's going to have wind molecules, it's going to have even the rocks of the buildings are moving very slowly. And we're going to have to go back to philosophy and atomism. This is a basic thing at the origins of classical philosophy. Are things more or less staying the same, or are they more or less always moving? This is the sort of fundamental question at the heart of many of our sort of musings and theorizations of this. There's no such thing as a place that isn't moving. There are places without cars going through them, if that's what you mean. I mean, that's a different question. And places without cars going through them is perfectly possible to think of as a wonderful place to be if there are lots of other things happening at the same time, lots of other things in place, so that it's just as well as and equitable as well as environmentally friendly.
Okay, I have another question, which I think you already explained it, but I think it's an important one, and I would like to ask in a different way, something I think probably you have already answered, but it's important to go back. Is our colleague Paul van Hemselvelde that says, what is the relationship between income and speed? I think you mentioned Ivan Illich.
Income and what, sorry?
What is the relationship between income and speed, seen from the mobility paradigm? Is the income, if the income is high enough, you can afford speed. If the income is low, you are condemned to slower forms of mobility. Maybe you can further develop this idea. You already.
No, I mean, I think
it's important.
Again, I think kind of on the face of it, there's some truth to that. But on the other hand, like I just said, people buy slowness. I mean, income can be related to slowness too. I mean, if you want to live the life that is promoted by those who promote the slow culture, slow town, slow food movement, you're probably wealthy. The boss in the Charlie Chaplin movie is slow because he's in charge. The people that have to be fast are the people running around the factory. In the Amazon factory, the people that are moving all the time are the people on the minimum wage, right? In the warehouse. The truth of it is that if you're talking about international travel, for instance, you can fly directly from one place to another internationally. Usually might be more expensive than if you have to take a slower route that might be cheaper. The plane will be the same speed. You're not really buying speed anymore on an airplane. You're all flying at the same speed, whichever class you're in. But if you can't afford the plane, then you have to take a slower route. So yes, there's some elemental truth in terms of transport to how quickly you can get from one place to another in some instances. But it all depends on the context. Slowness, velocity is something that's very interesting, but slowness and speed aren't necessary attributes of wealth. It depends on what you're talking about.
And then let me ask you something. I'm very much interested on your work as geographer and poet, and it's closely related to this conversation we have right now, I think. Is the concept of rhythm. So maybe what we need is a good rhythm. Let's say what people cannot afford is 25 stops in a bus. Maybe if you have only 2 stops, the rhythm of the travel is okay for you to read or to, but if you have 25 or 10, and if you are waiting a lot of time waiting on the plane, the rhythm of your travel is really bad. And also it's maybe more than being fast or slow, is the rhythm of the movement you have that creates a narrative which is meaningful to you. It's like a poem. The rhythm is something that brings the meaning, maybe.
Totally. I mean, I think that Henri Lefebvre's great book on rhythm analysis, it was a late work that only got translated into English relatively recently. It was incomplete, and he argued that any dominant group in society has to impose its rhythm. That's what it has to do. This is what's happening in the Charlie Chaplin movie, right? Is that this is about the early periods of mass production, Taylorism, Fordism in 1930s America. And what was happening was that a certain kind of rhythm of capital was being imposed on the bodies of workers through the conveyor belt. The conveyor belt designated the speed at which workers had to work. Similar thing is happening with the gig economy, just-in-time production, Amazon warehouses, like I keep mentioning. People are being tracked and traced and asked to move at a certain speed and taking up certain periods of their time. And so their rhythm is being, their life worlds are being colonized by rhythms imposed from somebody else. And so rhythm is a political thing that is about the relationship between mobility and stasis, and about other kinds of mobility.
Rhythm is a political thing, you said.
Yeah, I just used the very theoretical word "thing." It's a concept.
Rhythm is
so,
rhythm
is. Rhythm has a very profound politics to it. In fact, even in your question, you talk about the bus route, right? And you talk about 15 stops instead of 2 stops. Well, to you, all right, that sounds great. It's like, yeah, we get there quicker. Our rhythm is not interrupted. But when you get a bus route and you take 13 stops out of it, so there's only 2 stops left, the 13 stops that are taken out are in places where poor people live.
Yeah.
So they can no longer catch the bus without walking a long distance to the bus stop. So that is why rhythm has a politics to it. You have to think about that.
So one way to see one city, the quality of a city, is to see the choreography of the movement, of everybody moving in the city, how this choreography is well organized, or is functional, dysfunctional. So we can see the city as a place where there is a choreography of so many people doing so many things together. It's a good metaphor for you. Or it's not a metaphor.
It would be a good theoretical idea in the hands of the right person. So if I had the Edinburgh Observatory, and the Edinburgh Observatory was a kind of theoretical think tank with the resources to closely examine the relationship between all kinds of mobilities and the city of Edinburgh in a theorized way that was oriented towards social justice and environmental justice, it would be a great idea. If it was a group of people sitting in a room with screens all around them that were tracking and tracing every single citizen in the city in order to see if they were moving in the correct way, and then it would be a terrible idea. this would be a panopticon. I mean, this would be a Foucauldian moment where all mobility was traceable and trackable, and that is why there are understandable worries about aspects of our response to COVID. Is that part of it is about surveillance, and people on the left and people on the right don't like being tracked and traced, and they've good reason not to want to be tracked and traced, particularly if they're people of color. So there are cities like in China where this is being implemented it has been implemented. Every time you cross the street, you get pictures of your face taken, and you can get social credit, which help you get a mortgage or introduce you to certain networks. This is like a really horrible dystopian movie. This is a terrible idea. I mean,
it is a smart city. We are.
yeah, it's a very smart city, but it's not conceptually smart. It's just smart in a stupid sense.
We have one interesting question by Alexander Kalyukin. I would like to make you. How does the pandemic affect the meaning of home? The meaning of home. Does it become more static, or does it become more mobile, given the current increased online connectivity? So how you feel when you're at home, that you are in a node connected to other nodes, or you are in a fortress in a way?
Thank you, Alex, for the question. Nice to hear from you. So home is another fundamental concept that I deal with in my work, and we make homes in various ways, and it's generally thought of as a more or less static, concept. It's like you belong in a particular place, and it's sort of deep in time, whereas mobility seems to be a shallow horizontal thing, but I'm kind of inspired by those writers who think about this intersection of a vertical axis of time where you're deeply embedded, so you have a strong sense of belonging, rootedness with two O's, and at the same time this horizontal axis of travel and journey moving in and out, which is rootedness with an ROU, like, so they sound the same in English, but they're different words. So you get this cross, and people like John Berger wrote about beautifully that home is the place from which you travel and return to, and at the same time as you project yourself forward into eternity and backward into your ancestors. And so there's this, we don't all think of our homes that way because we don't live in rural France like John Berger did, but there is a truth to it that home is connected to if we can't travel away and come back to it, we start to lose one side of a dialectical relationship, that we're just home, that there's no outside of home. So our walks are very useful for that, but also our journeys. I haven't been to other places for years, or longer than a year and a half now, which was part of my life. And to be honest, a part of my life I enjoyed. I'd go away and I'd come back, and coming back, even sort of identifying the city from an airplane that you are landing in, and it's home, and you think, oh, there's my house down there somewhere, and you get closer and you get that feeling of return. And I realize I'm speaking from the position of privileged homeowner here, so that's not the same for everyone, but there's certainly some way in which our conception of home is being changed by this. I mean, we're seeing other people's homes. This is my office in my house. It's not my office at work. My office. See, I need to call it an office. It's not an office, it's a study. It's different because it's at home and not at work. And so we are seeing bits of people's lives in interesting ways without traveling in a physical sense. So I'm sure it is being, but I think our relationship to home will depend on our privilege and the degree to which we can be at home.
Then another question by Michelle Stork. You mentioned films and novels, fiction, let's say earlier. What do you think the humanities, literary, film studies in particular, art in general, I would say, can contribute to current debates in mobility studies?
Thank you again for the question. I think that it's fundamentally important. I mean, the different ways in which we access different forms of knowledge, broadly speaking, you divide them into creative ways and critical ways. I know there's other ways as well, but there's quite a nice division: people that make things and people that tear them apart, right? Critics and creators, but they both need to happen. And the creative part, which is also critical if it's good art, it just accesses things in different ways than if we are a scientist or a social scientist or even a humanities scholar. So I think one of the reasons that I come to mobility the way I do is because that I've been in deeply into literature, art, film, creative ways of thinking about the world. And it's impossible for me to imagine how you could get through, Ulysses and the Odyssey and early Spanish picaresque novels, Don Quixote, road movies, Easy Rider, Bonnie and Clyde, Thelma and Louise. If you can't engage with all of those things without realizing mobility has fundamental meaning and value to human existence. Mm-hmm. So if you engage with all of those things, and then you go to a book on transport planning that calls Commuting Dead Time and has lots of nifty diagrams with arrows going everywhere and equations, you bring something to that conversation. You bring this engagement with mobility as a meaningful and meaning-inducing part of our existence to the equation. And I think that that's fundamentally what happened when I started thinking about mobility, is that I was bringing those things from the arts and humanities to the table. And I think there's a lot of things emerging now. There's a group in Italy. I mean, Michelle might be one of these people, I can't remember, is in Italy, in Padua, who have started a Mobilities Humanities Center. And there's also one in Seoul in South Korea, a Mobilities Humanities Center, and a new journal on mobility and humanities. So I think history, literature, the arts, film studies, media studies, all of these things bring something to the table, and we should pay attention to their insights. I mean, film, just from the starting point, is moving pictures. So when when Henri Bergson, one of the great philosophers of motion, was thinking about motion, he was thinking about it in the context of the early history of cinema. How do you get a picture to move from one picture to another to create the illusion of mobility? Thinking that way is different from thinking about, derived demand. Derived demand has a place. I mean, it has a place in how we think about things, but it's just a different way of thinking. And I think that they all play a part.
Yeah, it's also a different way of feeling. So in order to influence people's way of thinking, emotions and feelings also matter. Yeah. In order to imagine the alternative future, you have to be able to use the proper words as well. If you stay with the words which have scientific narrow meanings, hardly you can create a narrative of the future which is much different from the present.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think that it's also representational strategies that allow us to influence the future in different ways. Planning documents and policy briefs are very good for planners and government officials, but the citizens of a place, different kinds of strategies are needed.
Yeah. Then I have plenty of questions. We don't have much time. Stephanie, for instance, is making a question that I will rephrase in my own way to include one of my questions, if I may do this joke. So we are learning a lot of things during the pandemics. This is true. You mentioned before all the experiences, but we may keep having the same needs, the same wishes, the same desires. So we know more things, but we have the same desires than before. Values don't change as quickly. So more information, even more knowledge, does not mean different values of beliefs. So what do you think? We are going to be, after the pandemics, to almost the same place we were, because we know more things, we are wiser, but we are the same in terms of values and wishes, or we move to a new era in a way. So it's beginning of something that is going to be different. What is the impact do you think pandemics will have? Because it's kind of shocking experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, I don't agree values change all the time. By the way, values aren't eternal. Values are things that people that change constantly, and a lot of the struggle that we have over political struggle in general is a struggle over values, and it sways between one end of the spectrum and the other, but I think that they do change over time. I mean, the values that we have, I mean, do you believe the values we have about mobility now are the same as they were in 1850? No, of course they're not. They've changed. The values that people, like in 17th century England, the average person couldn't move more than 7 miles from their house in a day. and many people never moved more than 7 miles beyond their house in their life. By 1850, there are railways all over the country. Obviously, values changed in relation to mobility in that period in 100 years. So yes, of course, values can change, and they change all the time. And that's what we should be doing, is we should be fighting battles on the field of values. It isn't all about rationality, it's about values. And so we have to be able to change those and believe in them. Now, do I believe they are changing now? I think, well, yes, some people's values are changing. I think that, the amazing things have happened with surprisingly little questioning by people who would normally question such things. So just the amount of money being spent by government in neoliberal countries is extraordinary. In countries that have been through decades of people telling them the government can't spend any money, the government suddenly decides it now can spend money because they've seen something, the COVID epidemic, that they believe they have to spend money on. So there's kind of a lie that's been revealed. Now, clearly, governments can't spend the money they're spending forever in the same way they're spending it now. I mean, I'm on the progressive side of the political equation, but even I don't believe that you can just keep spending money all the time. But what it's shown is that when people in power believe that a problem is real, then they will use extreme measures to deal with it. So the question that arises for me is if COVID is perceived and agreed upon as a problem that is worthy of dramatic action, both in terms of the amount of money people spend, but also in terms of the policies. Like in Britain, we had a policy, overnight from a conservative government that all homeless people should be off the streets and in hotels. Now, this wasn't because of a sudden belief that homeless people were of value themselves. It was a belief that homeless people might create illness for people who weren't homeless. They were a source of disease. This is what I think. I'm a skeptic. I'm cynical about this. This is the real reason for this. So suddenly, but the fact of the matter is, the rough sleeping population and the homeless population that sleep outside were suddenly put in hotels across the country very quickly. If it's possible then, it's possible in the future. If homelessness is conceived of as a problem that needs to be dealt with, then there is a way of addressing it. If, even more importantly, the environmental crisis is enormous. It's going to kill hundreds of times more than this pandemic will kill across the world, and it already has. The significance of the problem is much more long-term, and yet governments didn't do all these things to deal with global warming. Right? They were reluctant to react quickly. They didn't want to spend the money. They didn't. Part of the reason is that the temporal scale of the problem is different. It doesn't seem immediate. It seems longer term. But it's also about will. And I think that what the pandemic has shown us is that we have the capacity to do amazing things very quickly when we have the will to do it. As a government, as a citizenry in different countries, and as a global citizenry, we can get things done when we all come together and can think about that. We can suddenly have bicycle lanes in Milan when there weren't bicycle lanes before. We can make the streets safer for people to walk down. And there's been research that's come out today in London that shows this has actually been benefiting the poorest communities in London as well as the richer communities, is the way that streets have been re-engineered for more people to walk and cycle on. I think the evidence of people who are doing that, experiencing it, will be a shift. Whether that's not going to be revolutionary, we're not going to suddenly have a utopian moment after the pandemic, where all of these things become permanent. But there will be incremental change, and I think that there may have been shifts in some people's values along the way, who previously may not have conceived of or thought about these things. I'm an optimist as a person, but I'm not really an optimist in the kind of general social sense of there's going to be a massive transformation in the way we do things. I think a lot of things have to click in at the same time for that to happen. A lot of people talk about the new normal. I think the new normal will be slightly different from the old normal, but also quite similar.
Actually, this will be a great ending for the conversation, but I cannot resist to make you a last question by a great French economist Alain Bonafou, that person I will have the talk next week actually, and he's asking you the question I will ask him as well at the beginning of our talk. He asked you, and it's a tricky question. Do you think after this conversation that the project evaluations, the transport project evaluations we used to do based on welfare economics, at the end, they are based on translating social benefits into quantitative terms, in monetary terms, this will be less important tomorrow? He says less important tomorrow.
Well, I presume that's a general question about the future rather than tomorrow precisely. And I certainly don't think that I've changed everyone's opinion on how to do those. But I think, the thing about numbers is they have the capacity to influence people in a general way. And I think that individual stories don't always do that. But I think the report should have different ways of being reports, which have narratives in, with stories in, that we know have the capacity to change people's minds in ways that sometimes facts and figures and equations and algorithms don't. So yes, I mean, I think that the ways in which we should get it towards changing people's minds should have multifaceted strategies involved in them, and that should include these aspects I was talking about: meaning, social justice, impact on the environment, as well as things that are purely about the economy in the straightforward capitalist neoliberal sense of it.
Thank you very much, Tim. It was just perfect. I enjoy a lot. This 1 hour.
I enjoyed it too.
1 hour is too short, but anyway, everybody listening to us is now able to visit websites where you are publishing your articles, your books, many different videos you have of very interesting classes. So it was a pleasure to talk with you, and thanks for your contribution to our project.
You're welcome, and thanks for doing the project.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody. See you next week.